Something is breaking inside Iran right now, and it's not happening slowly, it's happening all at once. What you're watching is not a negotiation, not a standoff, not even a war in the traditional sense. It's the controlled collapse of a system that believed for decades it could outweight, outmaneuver, and outbluff the most powerful military alliance on earth. And for years, that strategy worked. Iran played the long game, stretching nuclear talks into endless loops, making demands, walking away, returning just enough to keep diplomacy alive while quietly enriching uranium, building deeper facilities under mountains, expanding proxy networks across the region. Everything built on one single assumption that the United States would never actually pull the trigger, that pressure would remain pressure, that threats would remain words, and that time would always be on Tehran's side. But time ran out, and when it did, it didn't fade away gradually, it snapped. The breaking point came not in a dramatic announcement, but inside a room during negotiations that were supposed to reset the entire trajectory of this conflict. Washington walked in with what officials described as one of the most generous offers ever put on the table: zero enrichment inside Iran. In exchange, the U.S. would supply enriched uranium for a full decade, guaranteeing civilian nuclear energy without giving Tehran the capability to build a bomb, a deal designed not just to de-escalate, but to remove the core justification for confrontation entirely. And Iran said no. Not just no, but no in a way that told the Americans everything. They weren't negotiating. They were stalling again. The same playbook, the same delay tactics, the same belief that the clock could be manipulated forever. And in that moment, something shifted inside the U.S. Strategic calculus, because this wasn't about one rejected deal. It was about pattern recognition, years of it. And the conclusion was blunt. Peaceful programs don't get buried under mountains. Peaceful intentions don't require fortified underground complexes. And a state preparing for coexistence doesn't behave like it's preparing for survival under siege. So the decision wasn't reactive. It was preloaded, waiting, refined over months, in some cases years. And when February 28th, 2026 arrived, that entire machine turned on at once. What followed was not a strike. It was a system-wide execution of a plan designed to hit everywhere that mattered at the same time, across domains, across layers, across command structures. A synchronized assault built to do four things simultaneously: disrupt, degrade, deny, and destroy Iran's ability to function as a coherent military power. And the scale of coordination alone tells you this wasn't improvised. Army, Navy, Air Force, Marines, Space Force, intelligence networks, all aligned, integrated with Israeli operations, targeting not just infrastructure, but the nervous system of the regime itself. And the results, if even partially accurate, are staggering, because this isn't just about explosions or facilities. It's about people, specific people, leadership nodes that held the system together. And according to multiple reports, dozens of them were removed in a matter of hours. Commanders, intelligence chiefs, missile program directors, naval leadership. The upper spine of the IRGC structure hit so fast that replacement mechanisms didn't have time to activate, and then came the claim that changes everything: the reported elimination of the supreme leader in a precision strike at his own compound, a decapitation strike in the most literal sense, removing not just a figurehead, but the central authority that arbitrated power between factions for over 3 decades. And whether you take that claim at face value or treat it cautiously, the narrative impact alone is massive, because once that center disappears, everything else begins to drift. and drift quickly turns into fracture. And here's where the story stops being about military capability and starts becoming about psychological collapse. Because removing leadership is one thing, but breaking the belief system inside a military is something else entirely. And the signs of that are already emerging in ways that are almost surreal. Reports of IRGC field commanders threatening defection if a political solution isn't delivered, not low-level soldiers, not fringe elements, but core operational leaders, the people who are supposed to enforce discipline now questioning whether the system is even worth defending. And it doesn't stop there, because what's being reported goes beyond descent into something far more dangerous: flight. Videos allegedly showing IRGC personnel crossing into Afghanistan, not redeploying, not repositioning, but escaping, using disguises, fake documents, choosing one of the most unstable environments on earth over staying inside their own chain of command. And if that image is even partially real, it tells you everything about morale, because soldiers don't run toward chaos unless what they're leaving behind feels worse. At the same time, the diplomatic layer is shifting just as violently, because the same regime that spent years projecting defiance is now signaling quietly at first, then more openly, that it wants talks again, outreach through intermediaries, messages passed through Oman, indications that Tehran is ready to re-engage. And the timing of that shift is not subtle. It comes after the strikes, after the losses, after the internal fractures begin to surface, which reframes the entire negotiation dynamic, because this is no longer two sides trying to avoid conflict. This is one side trying to stabilize after absorbing a shock it didn't expect at this scale, and the other side deciding how much pressure to maintain. But here's the problem, and it's a massive one. The gap between what the United States is demanding and what Iran is asking for is not just wide, it's structurally incompatible. Washington wants dismantlement, zero enrichment, removal of stockpiles, fundamental restructuring of Iran's military posture, essentially a reset of the entire system, while Tehran is pushing for recognition, sanctions, relief, retention of nuclear capability, and even compensation for damages. Two visions that don't overlap in any meaningful way. And that's why the ceasefire sitting in the background of all this isn't a solution, it's a countdown. Because as that deadline approaches, every actor involved knows that if no agreement is reached, the next phase won't look like the last one. It will escalate, either through renewed strikes, expanded blockade, or indirect retaliation. And sitting right at the center of that escalation is one of the most important pieces of geography on the planet, the Strait of Hormuz, a narrow corridor that carries roughly 20% of the world's oil, a choke point that Iran still has the ability to threaten, disrupt, or weaponize. And that single leverage point is what makes this entire situation unstable, because even a weakened Iran still holds a trigger that affects the global economy. And while all of this is unfolding externally, internally, the situation appears even more volatile, because without a clear central authority, factions begin to compete. The IRGC asserting dominance, political figures attempting to negotiate, different power centers pulling in different directions. And that fragmentation doesn't just slow decision making, it can paralyze it entirely, making it almost impossible for any one actor to commit to a deal, even if they wanted to. Meanwhile, the U.S. strategy isn't just military or diplomatic, it's psychological, layered, and very deliberate, combining pressure with messaging, including direct appeals to individuals inside the Iranian system, offering immunity in exchange for defection, essentially bypassing the regime and speaking directly to its components. And whether or not there's infrastructure to support those defections immediately is almost secondary, because the message itself plants doubt. And in a system already under stress, doubt spreads faster than orders. And when you step back and look at all of this together, the strikes, the leadership losses, the internal fractures, the diplomatic scrambling, the approaching deadline, you start to see a pattern that's hard to ignore. This is not a stable equilibrium breaking down slowly. This is a rapid destabilization event, a system hitting multiple failure points at the same time. And once that process starts, it's incredibly difficult to stop, because every attempt to stabilize one area creates pressure in another. Every delay increases risk. Every miscalculation compounds the next. And that's why the most important question right now isn't what just happened, it's what happens next. Because whatever comes out of this will not look like what went in. The structure, the leadership, the strategy, all of it is already changing in real time. And the only thing that's still uncertain is how far that change is going to go. Now, here's the part nobody is saying out loud. This isn't just about what was destroyed. It's about what's left, and what's left might be even more dangerous. Because when a system like this starts to break, it doesn't collapse in a clean, controlled way. It fractures, it splinters, and every fragment starts acting on its own logic, its own survival instinct. And that's exactly where Iran is right now, caught between two paths that both lead to escalation, not de-escalation, because on one side, you have a leadership structure that has been gutted, key figures removed, command chains disrupted, succession thrown into chaos. And on the other side, you have the remnants of a military apparatus, especially the IRGC, that still retains enough capability to inflict serious damage, but no longer operates under a unified, stable command. And that combination is volatile in a way that traditional warfare models don't fully capture, because deterrence depends on predictability. And right now, predictability is gone. What replaces it is fragmentation, and fragmentation creates risk, because different factions don't respond to pressure the same way. Some want survival, some want retaliation, and some want to prove they still matter. And that last group is often the most dangerous, because they don't need to win, they just need to act. And this is where the Strait of Hormuz comes back into focus, not as a background detail, but is the single most critical pressure point still under Iran's influence. Because even in a weakened state, Iran doesn't need full control to create disruption. It just needs the credible threat of disruption, the ability to signal that shipping lanes can be targeted, slowed, or shut down. And in a global system where energy flows are tightly linked to stability, even a small disturbance in that corridor can ripple outward. Fast oil prices spike, markets react, supply chains tighten, and suddenly what looked like a regional crisis becomes a global economic shock. And every actor involved knows this, which is why the naval dimension of this conflict is not just tactical, it's strategic leverage. And this is exactly why the U.S. response has expanded beyond strikes into something more sustained, a naval posture that isn't just about defense, it's about control. A blockade not necessarily designed to choke Iran completely, but to constrain its options, to box it in, to force a choice between escalation and concession. And that choice is being compressed into a shrinking window as the ceasefire deadline approaches. Because once that window closes, the next move won't be about signaling, it will be about action. But here's the twist. Pressure doesn't just push outward, it pushes inward too. And inside Iran, that pressure is amplifying every existing fault line, because without a central authority strong enough to enforce coherence, different power centers start testing boundaries. The IRGC pushing to consolidate control, political figures trying to reopen negotiation channels, regional commanders making localized decisions that may or may not align with any broader strategy. And that creates a situation where the state is no longer acting as a single unit, but as a collection of competing interests, each with its own timeline, its own threshold for risk, and its own definition of survival. And when that happens, decision making slows down at the top while speeding up at the edges, which is one of the most dangerous dynamics in any conflict because it increases the probability of miscalculation, a local action triggering a larger response, a response triggering escalation, and suddenly you're no longer managing a crisis, you're inside one. Meanwhile, the diplomatic track continues to exist, but it's operating under conditions that make success extremely difficult because the demands on both sides haven't just remained far apart, they've hardened the United States pushing for structural dismantlement of Iran's nuclear capability, not temporary limits, but permanent changes, while Iran is still signaling that it wants recognition, relief, and retention of core elements of its program. And those positions don't just differ, they conflict at a foundational level, which means any agreement would require one side to accept a version of the future it has spent years rejecting. And that's not something that happens quickly, especially not under pressure. And yet the pressure is exactly what defines this moment, because every day without a deal increases the likelihood that military options come back to the forefront, not as a last resort, but as a continuation of a strategy that has already begun. And that's where the concept of escalation changes, because it's no longer about crossing a line, it's about extending a trajectory. And if that trajectory continues, the next phase doesn't just target infrastructure or leadership, it targets capacity, the ability of Iran to sustain any form of organized resistance, which means broader strikes, deeper targeting, more aggressive enforcement of maritime control, and potentially actions designed to eliminate not just current threats, but future ones preemptively. At the same time, there's another layer unfolding that doesn't involve missiles or ships at all. It's informational and psychological, and it's shaping how individuals inside the system perceive their options. Because when messages are broadcast directly to military personnel offering immunity in exchange for laying down arms, it reframes the conflict at a personal level, turning loyalty into a calculation, risk into a choice. And when enough individuals start making that calculation independently, the cumulative effect can be significant because systems don't collapse all at once. They unravel one decision at a time. And this is where the idea of internal collapse becomes more than just a narrative. It becomes a mechanism, something that can be accelerated, something that can be influenced without direct occupation, without large-scale ground presence, by targeting the cohesion of the system rather than just its physical assets. But there's a limit to how far that can go without structure, because even if individuals want to defect, even if factions want to negotiate, there still needs to be a pathway for those actions to translate into outcomes. And right now, that pathway is unclear, which creates another layer of instability because it means intentions don't automatically become actions, and delays at that level can push events back toward escalation by default. And while all of this is unfolding, the broader geopolitical environment is shifting as well, because allies are being pulled into alignment decisions, sanctions regimes are being reconsidered, designations are being updated, and each of those moves adds pressure from the outside while reinforcing divisions on the inside, creating a feedback loop that's difficult to reverse once it gains momentum. So when you step back and look at the full picture, what you're seeing is not just a conflict between two states, it's a multi-layered transformation of a regional power under stress, a system being forced to redefine itself under conditions it didn't prepare for. And the outcome of that process is still uncertain, but the direction is becoming clearer because once a structure loses its central cohesion, restoring it is exponentially harder than maintaining it, and every passing day without resolution makes that restoration less likely. Which brings us back to the question that matters more than anything else right now. What happens if there is no deal, if the ceasefire expires, if the pressure continues and the internal fractures deepen? Because in that scenario, the next phase isn't just escalation, it's divergence, different actors moving in different directions, some pushing for survival through negotiation, others pushing for relevance through action. And that divergence creates unpredictability at a scale that's difficult to manage, even for the actors involved. And that's why this moment matters, not just because of what has already happened, but because of what it sets in motion. Because whatever emerges from this, whether it's a restructured state, a prolonged instability, or something in between, it will shape the balance of power in the region for years to come. And the decisions being made right now, under pressure, under uncertainty, under conditions of incomplete control, are the ones that will determine that outcome. And that's the reality that sits underneath everything you've heard so far. Not the headlines, not the statements, but the structural shift happening in real time, a system under pressure, a timeline accelerating, and a set of choices that are becoming more limited with